All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my friend Molly Knefel. Molly is a comedian, writer, and the co-host with her brother John Knefel of Radio Dispatch, which you can find at theradiodispatch.com. You can also find her on Twitter at Molly Knefel. Molly, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me back.
All right, so Molly, you recently wrote a couple of really, really great articles at Rolling Stone about the school-to-prison pipeline that's happening all across the country. So if people don't understand kind of the general concept, describe what exactly is a school-to-prison pipeline and how does it actually take place?
Right. I think that a lot of people might hear the phrase school-to-prison pipeline and have a kind of limited understanding that, this means certain kids in certain schools get in trouble, and without actually understanding that it's a set of structures that leads to certain kids being more criminalized, being treated in a way that more resembles them being criminals than students. So when you're talking about the school-to-prison pipeline, it's kind of talking about as somebody that I quote in the piece says, it's institutional policies and how those institutional policies connect on an individual level with kids. So, for example, disciplinary policies in schools that might be much more intense than they have been in the past. That might involve whereas in the past, children maybe were sent to the principal's office. Now you have children dealing with a school safety officer who, here in New York City, the school safety officers are part of the NYPD. They're not actually cops, but they are part. They're different, but they are still NYPD officers. So you have the situation where instead of a student who's misbehaving, being dealt with kind of by educators, by teachers, or by principals, instead you have students being dealt with by, NYPD officers. And you have the same in schools around the country. In Texas, kids can get tickets for disruption of class, and then that is a charge that they have to deal with in the court system. So it's basically...
So let's take that again. In Texas, when a kid misbehaves in school, and this isn't at all Texas schools, but in some Texas schools, instead of getting sent to the principal's office or sent to detention or anything like that, they can actually get an actual ticket where they're fined by the state of Texas.
Right. There's and like I said, I'm not from Texas. I just spoke with an advocacy group there called Texas Appleseed. But basically, there's this ticketing disciplinary policy where kids can get tickets for disorderly conduct or disruption of class. Again, these are things happening in school that are then tickets that they need to deal with in the court system. Sometimes it's adult criminal court, sometimes it's juvenile court. But whether it's juvenile court or adult court, those kids then are missing school because they have court dates. They have, sometimes there's fees involved, and so you have the kids literally you're removing them from the educational setting and putting them into a criminal setting. And once that happens, there's data that shows that once a child is experiences suspensions or experiences criminal court, then they are more likely, it's more difficult for them to escape that situation to stay on track for graduation. And as Donna Lieberman of the NYCLU said to me, you're putting kids on a track towards prison rather than on a track towards graduation.
It's really a very, very disturbing trend that's happening a ton. I remember some of the talk after it was the Newtown school shooting, and and a lot of it was like, well, we need to have more police officers in schools, and that actually is something that really is frightening to me. And like last month, because you've written about this, actually a couple articles of this at Rolling Stone, and when you wrote about it last month and how New York City, just the overall statistics of who actually gets punished in New York City, the majority of those who actually get punished are primarily black students. Even though only a third of the students in New York City are black, over half of those who actually receive suspensions in the past decade are black.
Right, and you see that disproportionate representation of African American students, not only in New York. The groups that I talked with in Chicago and in Texas both said that their data shows a similar disproportionate representation of African American students, as well as in New York City, low-income students and students with disabilities are affected by these policies at a far disproportionate rate. So disabled students are suspended more than their non-disabled peers. Black students are suspended more than their white peers, regardless of black students are more likely to be suspended than non-disabled white students or white students with disabilities. I believe that the group that is suspended the most, that experiences the most suspensions, is black students with disabilities, who I believe are only 1/6 of the population, but accounted for about a third of the suspensions.
Let's discuss a little bit, and I'm talking to my friend Molly Knefel from the Radio Dispatch, theradiodispatch.com. Just also, I think, of kind of a disturbing aspect of this is how we're essentially turning the schools themselves into a police state. And we talk about civil liberties a ton on this show, but just the idea that we want our children's schools to have armed guards walking up and down the street, that we up and down the hallways, that we have our kids going through metal detectors. Just describe some of what the actual situations that these kids are going to on a day-to-day basis. And instead of going to a place that actually is a welcoming and nurturing environment where they're supposed to be learning, how they're actually in an environment where they're constantly watched and monitored by not just, teachers and principals, but by actual police officers.
Yeah, I spoke with a student in Bushwick, and who goes to in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and who goes to a school with a metal detector, and she just said, that kids feel like they've done something wrong just by going to school. She said it's the exact opposite of how you're supposed to feel, and she said she had witnessed firsthand that. That students are disrespected by some of these school safety officers. And certainly, certainly plenty of school safety officers are, wonderful people who do a great job. It's not that, this isn't to demonize, the individual school safety officers, but that it's to say when you have this situation of, NYPD officers in schools at a rate, there's more school safety officers than there are guidance counselors. And those school safety officers don't have training about, youth development, don't have training about adolescent psychology, or even, knowledge of the special, if there's special needs populations at the school, they may not have training about how to meet those needs. So you just have the situation where the needs of the students are not being met, and similarly, it's also, I think, important to point out that this isn't a criticism of teachers or of educators. If you have a class with 30 or 40 kids, then you might, you might not have time to cope with each behavior disruption the way that that you might otherwise would. But again, these are behaviors that kids fight with each other, kids roughhouse, kids talk back. I mean, a lot of the suspensions in New York happen for quote unquote insubordinate behavior, which is obviously somewhat discretionary. So if you have kids being suspended, losing instruction time for insubordinate behavior, whereas again in another day they would have gone to the principal's office, served detention, had some sort of consequence that was given to them by educators. Now that discipline is being taken away from the educators and put into, and instead of educators being empowered that discipline is coming from NYPD safety officers and in the framework of the criminal justice system.